Hello and welcome everyone who is joining us today. My name is Alan Love and I'm the director of the Minnesota Center of Science, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our first international postdoc forum for the philosophy of science for the spring of 2022. As some of you may know, we began this forum to address what was the effects of COVID-19 and the pandemic shutdowns on recent PhDs and emerging scholars from across the globe. Our hope is that the virtual format, which is now more common, gives opportunities to showcase research presentations from international scholars with which we pair commentaries from local Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science community members. Today's presentation is from Emiliano Sfara, who is a postdoc at the philosophy department of the University of Sao Paulo. He is an Italian by extraction, but has been in Brazil for the last couple years. His research interests focus on the influence of Kant's ideas of organism in the work of Georges Canguilhem's philosophy of medicine and biology. He's also interested in the theoretical interconnections between philosophy of science, philosophy of action, and philosophy of artistic creation that also appears in Canguilhem's thought and his work that he's done now for several years. He's currently working as a part of a larger project that I'm also involved in, Agency Directionality Project. He's looking at the concept of organization in the context of ecosystems, which brings us, I think, to the topic of his presentation for today, ecosystem health and organizational perspective. So, Emiliano, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for inviting me. As you know, for this talk, I prepared some slides that I gonna read together with you, and these slides are the outcome of a collaboration. As Alan said before, I have just begun with a team of ecologists and biologists from the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil on a project on the study of functions in philosophy of biology and ecology. So, as Alan said, and as I am a philosopher, my slides dealing with philosophical, let's say, and at the moment, general issues that in the next months will be put to the concrete test of biology and ecology with the help of my work team. Work team members as Charbel, Clarissa Leite Machado, Jefferson Coutinho, Italo Carvalho, Neynut Netos, and others that I would like to thank as well. So I think I can share my screen and my slides. So this is the title, of course, and as you can see, well, just as you can see, my presentation is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I will try to explain the 2 main key concepts of my presentation. that is ecosystem health and organizational approach. Whereas in my second part, I will try to deal with the concept of organism health in the organizational approach, since the concept of organism health has been addressed by the organizational approach, and particularly from Christian Saborido, a member of this, let's say, team. And finally, in my third part, I will talk about the application. Basically, I will apply the organism health concept addressed in the second part to ecosystems as well, and from obviously an organizational perspective. So let's start with the first part. So in general, in short, according to a recent paper, I'm gonna read the slide with you as I said before. So according this paper titled "A Review on Ecosystem Health Research," written by Yu Yang, that I quote, "Publications on ecosystem health indicate a strong increase from 1989 to 2018. So by means of these publications, there are many questions to which philosophers and scientists are trying to answer. For example, first, can ecosystem be healthy? And second, is it possible to attribute to ecosystems a typical organism property such as health? Indeed, although the concept of health comes from the medical field and from the observation, accordingly, of the internal functioning of living organisms, a number of scholars believe that it's legitimate to extend this concept to ecosystems as well. And according, once again to Young and others, among the scholars, according to Young, Rapport and Robert Costanza, David J. Rapport and Robert Costanza, are probably the most representative figures that have contributed to a definition of ecosystem health. And in particular, Rapport argues that, I quote him, "The health metaphor draws attention to the fact that ecosystems can become ill, that is, develop signs of dysfunction resulting from anthropogenetic stress." So, however, there are many criticisms of this ecosystem health idea. And one of them comes from a paper published in 1993 by Glenn Suter, entitled "A Critic of Ecosystem Health." I'm gonna quote Suter, a very appropriate passage. I quote Suter: "Ecosystems are not living organisms, so they do not behave like organisms and do not have properties of organisms such as health." End quoting. And I have to say that despite this last thesis, this last issue, in recent years, a series of studies have pointed out that organisms and ecosystems may share an important characteristic, the organizational closure, indeed. And it is on the basis of this similarity, of this analogy, that I will try to talk about the concept of ecosystems held in the next minutes. But precisely, what does it mean, organizational closure? And secondly, what organizational approach is? I'm going to try to answer to these two questions in the next slides. By the expression organizational approach, I'm going here today to refer to a research network in philosophy of biology involving a number of scholars, for example, Álvaro Moreno, Matteo Mossio, Leonardo Bic, Kepa Ruiz-Mirazzo, and others, and different texts linked to this kind of approach have been published from the 2000 onwards. For example, Moreno and Mossio's book, Biological Autonomy, which states that indeed organization occurs when a set of organic parts interact in a coordinated way to collectively support a general function. An example of function, the heart function. We know that heart has the function of pumping blood. Insofar as pumping blood contributes to the maintenance of a living organism by allowing blood to circulate and by allowing other functions of the organism, for example, the digestive function of the stomach or other functions exerted by liver, lung, brain, and so on. But in turn, an organism's heart is produced and maintained by every single part of the organism considered as a whole, that is to say, by functions of brain, liver, lung, stomach, etc. If we just consider, I continue to read, in a given organism, the heart and the brain, on the one hand, the heart is the cause of the existence and functions of the stomach. But in the other hand, without an organ dealing with the digestion and food, that is to say, without a stomach, the heart would not be able to perform its blood pumping function. And obviously, the same can be said if we take another organ like the brain. Accordingly, I can conclude that the brain is in turn the cause of the existence and functions of the heart, forming a circular relationship between these two parts. This is what the organizational approach calls precisely organizational closure. So this is a very simple sketch. As you can see, this is an easy, indeed, sketch of what organizational closure is. As you can see, the brain in this case is the cause, and at the same time, the effect of the function, that is, of the activity of the heart, and vice versa. Next slide, please. Accordingly, a biological organism is characterized by a set of different organizational closures between two or more internal parts, not only heart or brain, that is not only organs, but all other parts like muscles, veins, and so on. And these parts support a number of functions contributing to maintain the whole system, that is to say, the organism itself. And next slide. Okay, this is an important point, an important theoretical point, because in last years, this concept of organizational closure has been applied to ecosystems. Particularly, two papers did that, and I refer to an article by Nunes Nato titled "Function in Ecology: An Organizational Approach," and secondly, a more recent article by Charbel Elani titled "Life on Earth is not a passenger but a driver." And I'm going to talk about, above all, mainly the second paper in the next slides. Next slide, please, Alan. So, according to Elani, there are two fundamental points to outline. First, as in the case of organisms, the ecosystem parts, which can called also constraints, interact in order to establish mutual dependence. That is, a number of organizational closures that accordingly can be also called closure of constraints. Second important point, constraints may correspond not only to an element, to an item of biodiversity, that is to animals, plants, and so on, but also to an abiotic entity, for example, clouds, rivers, rocks, and so on. And similarly, being involved in a closure of constraints, each constraint is both, once again, cause and effect of the existence and activity of the other constraints, and so of the ecosystem, of the reference ecosystem. Next slide, please. As you can read, as in the previous case of the function of hurt in organisms, let us consider, in this case, and following Elani and Nunes Nato, the function of marine microbiota in some ecosystems. Next slide, please, Alan. So this is a long slide that I'm going to read entirely because this is pretty important. It shows the organizational closure inside a reference ecosystem. So I'm going to read the functional effect. Of course, this is a part, in part, retrieved for, I would say, pretty entirely retrieved from page 77, 78 of Elani. The functional effect of the marine microbiota is to produce a sulfur compound, which is called dimethyl-sulfide in the ocean water, which is then ventilated to the atmosphere and suffers from a series of oxidations giving rise to clouds. A fraction of these clouds formed over the oceans will move to land, and when conditions for precipitation are fulfilled, they precipitate the sulfur along with the water. Thus, the sulfur atoms and molecules fall on land, reaching soils, lakes, and rivers, and are eventually carried back to the oceans through the rivers. Both the rivers and the rocks along them play a constraining role in this flow. In the ocean, sulfur will be available to marine microbiota, closing then the cycle. Next slide, please, Helen. So this case is a case of, as I said before, organizational closure in the reference ecosystem, since each part is at the same time enabling and dependent. If, for instance, we consider marine microbiota, on the one hand, it contributes to give rise to clouds, but on the other hand, it depends on the activity of clouds, that is, on precipitation. Next slide, please, Alan. And here we are in our second part, in which I will try to deal with the concept of organism health in the organizational approach. Next slide, please, Alan. This idea has been addressed in particular by 3 articles. Maybe the most deep in this sense is the article by Christian Saborido titled "Organizational Malfunctions and the Notions of Health and Disease." And secondly, we have also Saborido's PhD thesis discussed at the University of the Basque Country, and we last but not least a part of Moreno and Monsieur's book Biological Autonomy. But I'm gonna talk mainly of Saborido's article published in 2016. Next slide, please, Alan. So, what is health according to the organizational approach? The OA accordingly speaks of health when organism doesn't present malfunctions. That is to say, when the organism has not particular defects in the functions characterizing its internal parts. For instance, heart function, bile secretion function, so on. It means that in the presence of malfunctions, an organism finds it difficult to self-maintain itself. That is to say, to carry out its vital activities in, and this is important, external environment. That means that its vital normativity is diminished, and so that the organism in question is not healthy. Next slide, please, Alan. And so, according to the Saborido's article I'm talking about, there are two important things to outline. Firstly, biological organizations instantiate natural normativity. And this normativity is nothing but the living organism's capacity to respond to the demands of the external environment. And another important thing, secondly, health is not judged simply by the organism's ability to be statistically normal with respect to the species to which it belongs, but is judged by its specific individual normative capacity to adapt effectively to the context in which the organism lives. Next slide, please, Alan. I'm gonna quote now two passages from Saborido's article, because these are two appropriate passages in order to explain what I want to explain. First, I quote Saborido: "The organizational interpretation of correct functional behavior is very different from the concept of normal function. We don't need to appeal to a reference class or to an idealized type to justify when an organism is functioning incorrectly. The normativity of organizational malfunctions is based on the organizational properties of each token living being, end quoting. And again, I quote, organismic behaviors are normative since the preservation of life presupposes the organism's ability to establish and follow stable and flexible norms. Life is, in fact, a normative activity, end quoting. Next slide, please. And on this point, the organizational approach is inspired by the philosopher Georges Canguilhem, about which let's say that I studied in the last years. Canguilhem, in his book entitled "The Normal and the Pathological," state indeed that health is not judged by the organism's ability to be statistically indeed normal with respect to species to which it belongs, but by its specific and individual normative capacity to adapt effectively to an external context and environment. Next slide, please. Accordingly, according to this organizational view, malfunction, which is in turn closely related to this concept of health, malfunction is thus judged not only by considering the reference organism in its physical or physiological components, but also by considering its degree of adaptation to a specific environment. That means that saying that an organism presents one or more malfunctions means considering the environment in which the organism lives. Next slide, please, Alan. Just two examples of malfunctions to the organizational, according to the organizational approach. But I have to say that the examples in questions are mine, but it is very easy to explain. The case of pneumonia. Pneumonia is the inflammatory condition of the lung that represent a clear obstacle to the vital activity of the organism. So pneumonia is a malfunction insofar as it represents a clear obstacle to the vital activity of the reference organism, and not only because it is a physical or physiological malfunction, pathology, let's say. Another simple example, chronic gastritis, which precisely leads the individual, the organism, to have a diet not as varied as previously. That means that the organism ability to adapt to the environment and in the cases I just outlined is lower than before. So the organism has a lower normativity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Alan. However, according to Saborido, we have to say that biological organisms are characterized by mechanisms of adaptive regulation, which can compensate for malfunctions by keeping organism functions more or less intact. Next, please. we have here some cases in which functional decreases can be compensated by mechanisms of adaptive regulation in organisms. And we have just one case cited by Saborido at this time, the case of mitral valve prolapse, which is in general, very general terms, the swelling of one or both mitral valve flaps in an atrium, in the left atrium of the heart during the contraction of the heart itself. Next slide. And in fact, why I show this the previous slide, because it should be noted that a person with a malfunction and prolapsed mitral valve can remain asymptomatic and with excellent cardiac function throughout all of his or her life, thanks to, Saborido writes, myocardial adaptation mechanisms, which constitute an example of adaptive regulation, always according to Saborido. Next slide, please. Then what happens to the organizational structure in the organisms in which adaptive regulation occurs? Is that structure the same or not? We should say that without eliminating the incorrect behavior, during an adaptive regulation, a biological system can shift to a different regime of organization in which a phenomenon normally considered as pathological is no longer detected as malfunctional, but perfectly integrated with the other threats according to precisely this new regime of self-maintenance. Next slide, please. So I'm going to cite Saborido once again, a quote, to illustrate the way an organism can compensate for the breakdown of a component by shifting to a different regime of self-maintenance. We can compare two biological functions, the heart's pumping of blood and the eye's transduction of light. A failure that prevents the first function necessarily implies the death of the system, but in the case of the function of the eyes, the system can instantiate precisely a new organization in which the malfunction does not threaten global self-maintenance. And quoting, simply put, as I wrote below, a living being can become blind and at the same time stay alive. Next slide, please, Alan. And moreover, according to Saborido, we have cases in which the disorder of a function is not detected as incorrect by the specific organism, and accordingly, it doesn't cause an adaptive reaction. In these cases, we can speak of malfunction since the organism is healthy. An example, the Gilbert syndrome. Gilbert was a French physician. The Gilbert syndrome is a benign liver disorder in which the liver doesn't properly process bilirubin, which is a pigment contained in bile. Indeed, 1/3 of patients affected by this syndrome is completely asymptomatic and accordingly in health. Next slide, please. Here we are in our third part, in which I would try to apply the organism health concept we just have seen to ecosystems as well, and always obviously from an organizational perspective. Next slide, please. So in this part, I will attempt to apply this concept of health, and particularly the Saborida's concept of health to ecosystem, as I said. But in doing so, I will trace the presence or absence of malfunctions once again by referring to the activity of certain alien species with a given ecosystem. The latter, so the ecosystem, being understood as the specific environment in which the normativity of a set of living organisms unfolds. Next slide, please, Alan. So according to this organizational perspective, I will associate the so-called alien species with case A, cases of absence of malfunction, possibly due to mechanisms of adaptive regulation, which means that the ecosystem is healthy. And second kind of cases, case B, cases of malfunction, which means that the reference ecosystem is not healthy. Next slide, please, Alan. So, case A, these are the cases which one cannot consider as malfunctional. It is well known that several species, once alien, are today an integral part of many of the ecosystems on Earth. And moreover, other alien species are useful to human activity without generating any damage to the environment. The first example I have in mind is obviously, as you can imagine, the human being, but I wrote here just two examples, others two examples, just to cite an article by Davis dealing with the alien species. For example, we have the plant called Martiniano in Mexico, or the plant Tamarix in the United States. But obviously, we have many cases of species once alien that are now part of many ecosystems on Earth. Next slide, please, Alan. So from an organization perspective, these cases are not cases of ecosystem malfunction. Why? Since the normativity levels of the living organisms that previously inhabited the reference ecosystems are equally guaranteed. Simply put, the ecosystem persists in a healthy state because the living beings within it remain in a healthy state. Next slide, please, Alan. This could be due to often concomitant reasons, in my opinion. Namely, first, the emergence of a set of adaptive regulatory mechanisms, similarly to the case of organisms above, and two, to the fact that alien species did not affect the primary processes of the ecosystem organizational structure. In this case, in this kind of example of case, the ecosystem continues to self-maintaining itself, as in the case above of the organism remaining alive despite losing its sight. Next slide, please. B cases. So this is the case in which there are non-native species that could cause ecosystem malfunctions. Just an example, we are trying to analyze with my colleagues, of my work team of the Federal University of Bahia. The example is the Bombus terrestris. Bombus terrestris is a bumblebee, usually very common in Europe, but we know that its presence is reported in other geographical areas of the world. Next slide, please. So I want just to show some examples of ecosystem malfunctions from Bombus terrestris due to Bombus terrestris. First example, insufficiency of the ecosystem function related to the feeding of various species due to the tendency typical of the Bombus terrestris to steal different food sources from other bees or insects. And to illustrate this example of ecosystem malfunctions due to Bombus terrestris, I'm gonna quote a passage from a work by a Brazilian scholar, Acosta. The work is called Bombus terrestris can arrive in Brazil. I quote Acosta. Bombus terrestris in Israel started its foraging earlier than other bees and exhausted the nectar of several flowers, drastically reducing the resource shared with other bees and excluding geographically other species. End quoting. Next slide, please, Alan. A second example of a malfunction due to Bombus terrestris. Bombus terrestris gives negative effects on offspring production. And for these, I'm quoting once again Acosta. Also in Japan, Acosta writes, the increase in the number of invasive Bombus terrestris colonies has generated a reduction of the reproductive fitness of native bumblebee species through interspecific crosses, producing non-viable offspring. End of citation. Next slide, please. And we are finally arrived to my conclusions. I can say, and as you can read, that in very, very general terms, as I said previously, organization is the capacity of a system components to interact with each other in order to compose and regulate the system of which they are part. So if it's possible to speak of health, in my opinion, when the parts of an organism fully perform the functions that maintain the organism is in a normative interaction with the environment, it's for me possible to speak of health. when the system in question is the ecosystem. In fact, the latter, the ecosystem, is healthy when the biotic elements that compose it are themselves healthy. That is, when they fully carry out the functions, allowing the system maintenance by virtue of an effective normative action. Next slide, please, Alan. In the last examples I gave, the ecosystems invaded by Bombus terrestris didn't appear in perfect health. We can say that these ecosystems were in a pathological state. But as pointed out by the organizational approach, what is pathological is not opposed to what is commonly defined as normal, but to what is precisely normative. And normativity can be assessed by the ability of living beings to live healthily within a given ecosystem. For instance, a heavily decreased biodiversity or a persistent mortality among species could be a concrete index to assess an ecosystem by attributing it a pathological state. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, in my talk, during my speech, by adopting an organizational perspective, I try to dwell on the very general concepts, allowing to establish a basic analogy between organisms and ecosystems when one talks about health, but a study, of course, that accounts not for analogies, but for certainly numerous, many differences will be necessary. And I finished. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let me thank Emiliano again for a wonderful presentation. Really appreciate the opportunity for us to have these conversations in this forum. I want to just highlight before we end that for those who are interested, we will have another on April 13th, about 2 months from now, Making Peace in the Statistics War, Simulation Studies in the Philosophy of Statistics by W.J. Payton from philosophy at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. But with that, let me bring our event to a close. Thank you all for attending and for your time and perspective. And we hope to see you in the very near future. Take care now and bye-bye.
Thank you again.